Thanks, Andrea. Hello, Vanessa. Hello, I'm Sophie. Nice to have you. I will start the introduction by reading a quote from a text of Anne-Sophie and Frederick Venema called Teaching by Heart. Bake an alphabet out of bread dough with the children. Take them outdoors and have them collect natural and artificial objects, and then let them sort their findings, using all their senses. In 1682, German mathematics professor Erhard Weigel suggested not only to use the arts for primary education, but also to introduce practical education into university curricula, because knowledge about making things, regardless of their origins in the visual arts, sciences, engineering, or medicine, could not rely on textual transmission alone, but needed experience and experiment in order to be comprehended and further developed.
Anne-Sophie Lehmann holds the chair of the Faculty of Art History and Material Culture at the University Groningen, as well the co-director position of the Research Center Arts and Society. Her research explores how materials, tools, and practices partake in the meaning-making of art, how images and text represent and reflect creative practices, and how knowledge about making engenders material literacy. Anne-Sophie studied art history at the University of Vienna and Utrecht. In 2002, she became assistant professor and later associate professor at the Department of Media and Cultural Studies at Utrecht. Lehmann has published widely in English, German, and Dutch, and has received fellowships from the Warburg Institute, the Getty Research Institute, and the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. She's also editor for the forthcoming series Studies in Art and Materiality, and serves on the editorial board of the Netherlands Yearbook of History of Art and Kunstschrift.
Vanessa Backhuizen van het Hoogt is a PhD candidate in the Department of Art History and Material Culture. Her research is part of the project Curious Hands, moving making to the core of education, and focuses on the way in which making is learned and taught in educational workshops. She strives to answer the question how patterns of teaching and learning making can be made explicit, including embodied processes and material knowledge. Vanessa develops and teaches various object-based, hands-on and experiential courses at the Faculty of the Arts. She holds a research master in art history of the University of Groningen. Also, she was co-founder and curator at the Living Gallery Groningen, a gallery and project space, and has been working as a writer, writing coach and presenter for Head Resort, which is an artist in residence space in Groningen. Welcome, and we're looking forward to your lecture.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you for the invitation. We are very glad to be here as part of this exciting lecture series and the collaboration between the Hochschule für Künste Bremen and the University of Groningen within the artistic PhD. The research we present today is strictly speaking not artistic research, since none of the researchers are practicing artists. But the Curious Hands project researches foundations of artistic practice and uses, among others, art-based methods. The project Curious Hands, Moving Making to the Core of Education, and you see here all the project members, our research team, and this is a project funded by the Dutch Research Council for a period of 5 years. The project Curious Hands, Moving Making to the Core of Education researches how making is taught and learned in 2 different educational settings. Maker labs in secondary schools, and this is the work of Imka Burke, and the workshops of the Art Academy Minerva in Groningen. Next to these projects, we collaboratively work on a theoretical scaffolding and a methodological matrix to study making in concrete contexts. Today, I will start by presenting underlying thoughts for this scaffolding, and in the second part, Vanessa Backhuizen van het Hoogt, will explain the shape and content of the matrix and how it has been applied so far. And I will take you now into quite a sort of theoretical journey, so please bear with me. There is not yet a field or a discipline that concerns itself solely and explicitly with the question of how and why things are made. Rather, studying making as a practice happens in many different disciplines within and beyond the humanities and social sciences. And together they have, roughly since the early 2000s, developed a shared body of theories. At their core lies a conviction that was expressed in a nutshell on the first pages of Richard Sennett's foundational book, The Craftsman, from 2008. And here, the sociologist of whom you see here, a portrait, presented the motto, "Making is thinking," as his guiding intuition, he called it. Based on Hannah Arendt's seminal work, The Human Condition, Sennett studied with Hannah Arendt in New York, and various phenomenological thinkers who had acknowledged making as core human activity and its practices and products as a defining feature of humanity from political, environmental, and anthropological perspectives, Sennett foregrounded manual material engagement as an intellectual practice and showed that making was worth to be studied in and of itself. Sennett also expressed the quite ambitious benefits that such studies might have when he wrote, "We can achieve a more humane material world if only we understand the making of things." So that's quite a good reason, I believe, to study making. Scholars from various fields had preceded Sennett, among them John Dewey, Henri Faucillon, Rudolf Arnheim, and Vernon Lee, and many more would follow in this conviction. And by the early 2010s, something like a multidisciplinary approach to making studies had emerged, drawing on many fields: anthropology, archaeology, art history, cognitive sciences, craft and design studies, gender studies, history of science, this is alphabetical, material culture studies, pedagogy and educational sciences, philosophy, and science and technology studies. And this is probably not inclusive. Scholars from these fields quickly developed and expanded existing theories and methodologies for the study of making, such as actor network theory, visual and sensory ethnography, participant observation, critical making, material and object-based analysis, reconstruction, and reenactment. As part of this undertaking, a variety of theoretical concepts and terms have emerged and were repurposed and combined to capture what making is and what it means. So let's say an epistemology and ontology of making. And I'm showing you here again in alphabetical order a number of these concepts: affordances, agency, assemblages, correspondence, doing and making processes, ecologies of practice, entanglements, which is the title also of this lecture series, meshworks, madeness, networks, practice theory, taskscapes, thought things, and vibrant matter. And then these were also combined into new concepts: material agency and material engagement, and assemblages of practices. And you see the names of the scholars associated or who published these terms in parentheses behind them. More could certainly be added, working towards an alphabetical glossary of related terms and concepts, but that is not my ambition today. Though each concept originates in a different discipline, they are all related in their intention to grasp the complexity of making and underline the equal importance of its components, materials, tools, and makers, which, and that is one of the foundational findings of studies of making, which all have agency or even a life of their own. And this is a lithography press in one of the workshops in Minerva Art Academy. Both insights that making is complex and that its components are equally important and not subject to a hierarchy of mind above matter have been foundational for the study of making to develop in the first place. Next to this still rather general terminology that reflects these insights, the terminology I just showed you, the ongoing consolidation of the study of making was initially driven by a number of assumptions that the researchers involved in studying making more or less agreed upon. Let's look at these assumptions a bit more closely. First, making was generally perceived as driven by embodied, or as Michael Polanyi called it, tacit knowledge, and therefore as an accumulation of several, often simultaneous actions, the motivations of which are not necessarily apparent. This characteristic, scholars have argued, is difficult to grasp with the foremost instrument of academic study, the written word, text, language, because of the sequential nature of text. And even images, which despite their affordance to capture simultaneous actions, and in the case of moving images also sound, cannot capture bodily knowledge completely, or so it seems. Richard Sennett, for instance, described tacit knowledge as thousands of everyday movements, unspoken and uncodified in words, locked up in the body of the maker and irrevocably lost with her death. He described this body as a vault of tacit knowledge that needs to be unlocked in the quest to understand making. Therefore, if we follow this paradigm of tacit knowledge and Sennett, the thinking part of making is thinking is therefore assumed to be largely intangible or ungraspable. The second aspect on which researchers of making generally agreed is that dualisms, such as those between making and thinking, material and idea, matter and idea, material and form, practice and theory, or what Tim Ingold has called hylomorphisms, have to be deconstructed. And I'm just, these are the two sides in the dualist model of hylomorphism. Hylo means matter and morph, form, and together we need them in order for things to be in the world. Everything needs to have a form and is made out of a matter. But the problem that Ingold points out is that there is a hierarchy at a certain point. And that hierarchical idea I've tried to express here with the size of the letters. So these dualisms need to be deconstructed. Once we do that, a definition of making, as for instance Ingold gives it, can serve to illustrate this point. Making, Ingold writes, and you see him here playing the cello. Both Sennett and Tim Ingold are cello players and use their music making, bring it into their theoretical thinking. Making, Ingold writes, is a process of correspondence, not the imposition of preconceived form on raw material substance, but the drawing out or bringing forth of potential immanent in a world of becoming. In the phenomenal world, every material is such a becoming, one path or trajectory through a maze of trajectories. End of quote. In 1934, the French art historian Henri Faucillon had made a similar plea to understand materials as having a form and existing in an ecology of interacting materials. So we've now seen that there are two assumptions about making that scholars agreed upon. First, it's difficult to capture in words because it's tacit. And secondly, we have to understand it as sidestepping familiar dualisms. Thirdly, researchers of making agreed that their object of study must be encountered in practice, by observing making in the wild, so to speak. In addition, there is a growing consent that personal experience with making is very beneficial to its understanding. So not only observation, but also participant observation. Ethnography, therefore, soon became a central research method for studying making, and thus a connection between traditional humanities and social sciences was forged. Based on these three commonalities I have just described, a fourth insight characterized initial approaches to studying making, namely that making is messy and unruly, in particular when it is creative. And the whole seems to lack a structure in the sense that structure is seen as rigid and restrictive. Taken together, these insights made for a challenging prospect and raised the question how to study a phenomenon that, and I now deliberately exaggerate, is tacit and invisible, is impossible to describe with language, evades familiar dualisms, can only be experienced from within, and is generally unstructured. The frameworks and theories and notions and approaches that I showed earlier, and here you see them again, in part, of course, answer this question, because they propose theoretical approaches that can cope with all these difficulties. Or, and that is what we have been questioning ourselves in our research, can they? We suspect that by positioning the complexity of making outside the domain of language, but by resorting to language as the familiar analytical tool nonetheless, something interesting happened in this historiography of studying making. In order to develop theories for making, researchers did not so much describe making in itself, but its apparent complexity as a thing in its own right. Each bringing their own theoretical preferences and genealogies to the table, creating what one could describe as a theoretical thicket. The resulting theories of making are certainly technical and poetic. They are encompassing and holistic, layered and nested. They are useful and interesting. And sometimes they're an experience in themselves, as Harm emailed Andrea and me last week when he thought about wrestling with Dewey. I thought it was a wonderful instance of such an experience of theory. And most of these theories have done a lot for putting making on the map as a real subject. But rather than answering the question, how to study making, they reflect its perceived complexity by becoming themselves complex. They might therefore also be called impractical, because they invite scholars who want to engage with the study of making, not so much to study making, but to reiterate all these theories and to add on, thus potentially thickening the theoretical thicket even further, as I am, maybe in your opinion, doing right now. These theories of making also have a slightly myopic fascination for the beauty of process. The beauty of processes of making. Questions about where making occurs, who makes, what materials and tools are available to whom, how the outcome is valued economically, in short, the socio-political and economical aspects often tend to disappear behind the agreement that making in itself is certainly good and always interesting. On the other end, the study of making produces currently a rising number of very distinct and very informative case studies of all kinds of making, based mostly on an ethnographic immersion in very particular practices, such as, for instance, glass blowing, or the reconstructions of recipes from a 16th century recipe book. This is a huge project that was took place in New York for a number of years. Or I immerse myself as an ethnographer in the study of baking or smithing or embroidery. So this is happening at the same time as this theoretical thicket. Therefore, today, the study of making finds itself at an interesting point. There is lots of complex and rather similar theory, as you see over there, and there is lots of data and methods to gather that data. But there is not yet a clear way to structure the data and loop them back to test the theory. So what is missing is a methodological bridge between the deep theory of making and detailed ethnographic description. Or, in other words, approaches to distill from theory on the one hand and case studies on the other, some overarching guidelines and approaches for the study of making. Approaches that one could hand to a student who wants to study making and say, here, why don't you try this? See if this works. What has helped us in trying to develop this approach that Vanessa will now present is that the field of making has started to critically assess the foundations on which it was built only such a short while ago, on the basis of its own results. First of all, it appears that making is not so tacit after all, but uses the entire sensory expressions of the body, speaking, hearing, touching, tasting, seeing, smelling, and often also in relation with others. Also, the idea that language is not apt for describing making needs to be revised. Studies of making have not only unearthed an extremely diversified vocabulary, which we simply had forgotten about or had not yet seen, they have also developed a better way to describe making and show that language cannot be thought as separate from making, but that reading and making, or speaking and hearing and making, occur together. Roger Kneebone, the author of the 2019 best-selling non-fiction book Expert, who has come to the study of making quite recently from yet another discipline, medicine, aptly writes about this potential of language to understand making. Communication cannot happen through books alone, or even through images. It takes place at the intersection between your body, another person's body, and the physical world around you both. An expert teacher reveals unsayable things by demonstrating and by highlighting whatever is crucial for you at that moment. This quote by Roger Kneebone already hints at why we ended up in looking at educational workshops. Finally, the notion that making has to be messy, chaotic, and quite unstructured if it is to be creative has also been questioned through the very study of making. Not only because studies of making show that even the most messy making has its own structure, but also by asking if it is not problematic to describe and perceive the entanglement of practices, of bodies, experience, stuff, space, as a complex chaos. What if one turns this notion around and simply acknowledges that we were not able to see the structure of making, perceive the chaos, but once we study it, we also start to see the structure. However much one would like to save the notion of messy creativity, studies of making show that even messiness has its own structure. Many of such recent insights stem from observations of making in pedagogical environments, and that is also how Kneebone came to making, because he started to teach doctors and artists and musicians. And this is also where the Curious Hands project turned to in order to study making. And at the same time, also, because the project wants to make a plea, together with many others who are currently doing this, for the necessity and the potential impact of knowing how to make for society at large. And I would like now to give the word to Vanessa, who will start to show you how the chaos of making can be untangled and get structure.
Okay. Yes, hi, everybody. You can hear me, right? Great. So since 2017, we have been carrying out informal and formal ethnographic research into making in an educational setting, as Sophie already said, the 14 workshops of Minerva Art Academy in Groningen. In this setting, making becomes explicit. We used a mixed method approach that combines interviews with the workshop specialists and students, observations of these specialists and students during making, so observing distinct teaching and learning situations, and participant making. The latter draws on critical making, the engagement in material production in order to gain insights into social and cultural contexts. Participant making enables researchers of making to follow the same steps as the specialists and students in the workshop. As a core method in ethnographic research, participant observation includes actively partaking in the studied context, in our case, learning making. The emphasis on participant making, however, highlights the specificity of this activity, which impacts the way in which information is noted down. During participant making, hands are occupied and any field notes can only be made after the fact. To enhance the observation of my own making, I started to use a GoPro camera so that steps and actions could be retraced. More on this subject later. Now, based on our insights, we define making and present the research methods which enable us to study making in educational workshops and therefore help us to get insights in the epistemologies of these workshops. We departed from the notion, and the notion is seen here on the slide, that making is a temporary creative unit fixed in time and place in which materials, tools, and makers interact. Based on our research, we expanded this definition to further distinguish the characteristics of making. Making is an experimental, reflective, and relational process fixed in time and place in which materials, tools, and makers interact. Making is fixed in time and space, which means that it is therefore temporary in the sense that the interaction has a beginning and an end, which does not mean that every step along the way has been outlined beforehand. Making is experiential because the interaction between materials, tools, and makers inevitably involves bodily experiences with all the senses. Making is experimental, in the sense that it is an open-ended process that involves trying out something, so trial and error, in order to experience what happens, including diverging feelings such as curiosity, uncertainty, frustration, and awe. Making is relational in the sense that interactions during making between different actors can be meaningful. Making is reflective in a sense that through the actual process of reflection before, during, and after making, or as Donald Schoen defined it in the 1980s, reflection in and on action, makers give meaning to their interactions, relations, and results. Viewing the research situations, and now the broad or the more specific definition of making move to the core of this of the circle. Viewing the research situations against the background of this definition, we encountered 4 recurrent phenomena, which the main which the main constitutes of making, materials, tools, and the makers, need to interact. So these are the fours that are here around the circle, which I'll read now. These phenomena have to do with spatial organization, movement in space, the instructional affordances of stuff, and oral communication ranging from spoken word to machine noise. And we have defined them, as you can see here, as geographies, choreographies, instructional stuff, and sound. They are phenomena of making in general, as well as the educational workshops in particular, and function at the same time as categories of the research matrix we propose here. So the circle, that is our matrix. The four categories, and again, that's geographies, choreographies, instructional stuff, and sound. You could make a drinking game of this because I'm going to say that a lot. But yeah, don't do that. They serve to study making and have been chosen because they allow for fine-tuned analysis of the process of making. Other than the categories of time, place, materials, tools, and makers, including sensory perception, emotions, and feelings, our four categories include all of these and therefore naturally bring to light the cultural, economic, political, environmental, historical, ethical, and social circumstances of making. We specifically propose matrix because, and I think in Sophie, her talk that became already clear, it highlights that the notion of complexity of making does not exclude structure and enables us to sort the elements we identified into a workable research approach. We are aware of the reciprocity of the research in process, so we're still doing this, could still change, and also the theoretical framework that is still developing, so new findings can lead to additions and adjustments to this matrix at all times. Before I will go into explaining these four categories, let's first go back to the workshops of an art academy as a research environment. Why would you do that in an art academy, actually? Just as it is very intuitive for bird watchers, as artist Jenny Odell points out, to seek out the places where certain species live, we study making in the context where it naturally and continually occurs, the workshops in an art academy. Each art academy has an idiosyncratic workshop structure, but the workshop always lies physically or metaphorically at the heart of every art academy. Art academy workshops are pressure cookers for making art and design, and thus cover a scope of techniques and materials ranging from lithography and metal to laser cutting and plastics. Workshops at art academies are spaces where making is taught as a skill and idea before the intended products conceal into objects of art, crafts, and design. Making can be best studied in an educational context because the nature of making in a broad and general sense becomes explicit in a teaching situation. As such, the Art Academy workshop prefigures the professional workshop site or the studio as a site of inquiry. In art academies, a pre-industrial infrastructure of craft workshops structured according to the materials and techniques have survived. So woodworking, metal, printing techniques, textile, clay, plaster. I think you know, there are 16 here in Bremen and 14 in Groningen. So I think you have an idea of what that means. But these are special type of workshops that we're talking about here, since their aim is not to train students to become an expert, for example, a furniture maker, but to teach them the endless possibilities of materials, techniques, and tools at hand in these diverse workshops. So, for example, to get to know something about wood. Throughout their training as an artist and or designer, students change, combine, move back and forth between various materials, techniques, and tools. In the workshop, students are, on the one hand, taught the basis of various materials, techniques, and tools, especially at the beginning of their study. Proceeding in their study, students are, on the other hand, increasingly invited to experiment with these materials, tools, and techniques, and to embrace the uncertainties that go hand in hand with this experimental process. In the words of the woodworker, designer, and writer David Pye, who writes in the 1960s, students are taught to adopt the workmanship of risk as opposed to the workmanship of certainty. The workshop specialists teach the students in both of these principles, so of certainty and of risk. So they learn to oscillate between these two. That's why I made also these curving lines. They learned to go back and forth between certainty and risk. Students need to get acquainted with and experience the affordances, properties, and possibilities of materials and techniques to a certain extent before they can experiment and take risks. How much knowledge and certainty is needed depends on the material and technique in question. For example, experimenting with lithography, I don't know if you did or anybody did here, requires much more knowledge and more certainty than, for example, experimenting with a Riso printer. The affordances Art Academy workshops provide for students are entirely dependent on the architectural space, tools, machines, and materials, and the preferences of the workshop specialists, who are usually highly experienced artists/craftspeople. Some of the specialists, at least in Groningen, I don't know how that is here, regularly work on their own projects in the workshops next to giving instructional workshops or courses and individual guidance. After a few conversations with specialists here in Bremen, I noticed that the educational background of the specialists here differ from the specialists in Groningen, which is probably also due to the different educational systems in Germany and the Netherlands, I guess. But I really want to do more research into that too. Several workshop specialists in Groningen, and I don't know, probably that's the case too, I think so in Bremen, actually consider their job as tailor-made for them, since their personalities and intrinsic interest in making, as well as passing on the knowledge about making, is really fitting for this job description of a workshop specialist that fits it like a cloth. In comparison to teachers, and I think you know that as art students all, workshop specialists are not grading students' work and efforts, yet they play an indispensable role in the educational process of making. Precisely because they have no role in assessing, students can explore and learn about materials and techniques without the pressure of immediate judgment. In workshops such as at the Art Academy Minerva or the Hochschule für Künste Bremen, students from all departments and all years are trained and taught. And they can go there at any times. Here you even have the key thing. I heard, I haven't used that yet, but I heard that you have that. At the Art Academy, not only the boundaries between different materials and their associated crafts like woodworking, metal, or printmaking, but also those between art and craft in general become diffuse. The Bauhaus family famously advocated such crossovers with well-known restrictions, and such interdisciplinarity was already a feature at the very first academies in the Renaissance. In sum, workshops at art academies are spaces where art, design, and craft, novice learner and expert, young and old, digital and analog, all genders, and diverse cultural backgrounds merge, come together, and are in constant flux. And now I'm argued why actually study art academy workshops, and I'm going to go into these categories. The 4 categories that we started with. The following descriptions are salient illustrations of the above mentioned categories, so that I already did, the choreography and the geographies, the instructional stuff, and sound. These descriptions draw from interviews and participant observations. As I already said, that's the whole project that we're doing. And we can take that to include participant making. You saw me already with the GoPro, so you know I did that. So we're going to go into geographies right now. We're going to start there. During a hands-on session in a lithography workshop in 2018, a group of first-year art history students And I should explain that Sophie and I take students from art history to the workshops as part of a first-year art history course. These students were listening attentively to the explanations of the workshop specialist. We seated close to each other around a long table, which was positioned in between the printing presses and placed against the wall. Back then, the workshop was actually lacking space and needed more room for traditional classroom explanations and a clean environment for looking at finished prints. So I didn't have a photo where you could only see the table, but there are people standing in front of the table that they were actually sitting on. But that is the table where he's now explaining something on the limestone. And that is how the lithography workshop looked back then. And this is how it looks now, actually. So in 2019, a new space was added to the workshop exactly to serve these purposes that I was just saying that were missing. The space of the workshop has an elongated shape and is arranged according to the structure of the technique. It is quite convincing that that fits. It's a long space and it works for this kind of technique. Reading left to right, in the back you start preparing the limestones, and they're also stored there. And then you have the preparation in the middle, and next there's the printing area with the presses and the ink and the sink and all these stuff that you need for that. And then lastly, now you have really a clean space where there's no ink, nothing, and you can have your clean prints there and actually sign them, number them, and do these kind of things that need that. And then you also have this little, I don't think they used it that much, the little office where the workshop specialist has his computer and stores paper. Another example, in the plastic workshops, the room for instruction and explanations, a table with stools is placed in the, is placed in the middle of the machine. So that's the table there with the small circles. This is of course not ideal, and just like the specialist from the lithography workshop, the plastic specialist would also prefer to have an additional space for more traditional classroom instructions. The plastics workshops is based around a contemporary material instead of a traditional technique such as lithography, and the workshop specialist actually divided it into 4 areas. Someone who visits the workshop finds themselves in the office first. That's area 1. A space with a desk, a couch, inspirations pinned onto the walls, and a shelf with examples visualizing the effects of the machines and different techniques. And then in the second area, there are all machines located there and techniques which actually produce dust. There are doors in between all these areas. The third area is categorized based on materials and techniques that need heat to be worked with. So that's, for example, thermoforming machines. The last area is what he calls the chemical laboratory, where actually the plastics are handled in their liquid form. All areas have appropriate exhaust system, and the specialist thoughtfully considered where electricity, exhaust systems, things, and so forth were needed in the space when he furnished the workshop 10 years ago. So it's also a workshop that is not actually that old in comparison to clay and plaster at the academy, which is already there forever, I think. Next to this categorization of the workshop, the specialist also color codes the workshop. Oh, I think I forgot one. No? Huh. I switched up 2 slides, but we go here first. Next to this categorization of the workshop, the specialist also color codes his workshop. So smaller objects and tools tend to wander around the Art Academy building. I think you know that. They kind of live their own life. He therefore sprays movable objects and tools green. For example, if he sees a green stool in another part of the building, he can take it with him back to his workshop, which is quite handy. He does that with everything that he gets, it's green. Outlining stuff on the wall, for example, a ruler, or on containers, for example, scissors and markers, and or labeling materials and tools is a way to keep the stuff in the right place within the walls of the workshop. Also here in Bremen, I saw that while I was here too. For example, in the silk screen workshop that is here on the photo with the glue. In the plaster workshop and also in the paint workshop, that is also the case in Groningen, where you see the outlines of hammers or other tools on the walls. The geographies of workshops vary depending on materials and techniques, as I showed now, the personal and educational beliefs of the workshop specialists, as well as the available space. It's also, if you don't have space available, yeah, then you have to deal with what you have. The former dock of the Bremen harbor affords other arrangements of spaces than the building specifically designed by Piet Bloem in the 1980s to house Minerva Art Academy. That is a fact. That is different spaces that actually afford different things for workshops. Even though each workshop is arranged differently, there are common aspects such as marking down the outlines of tools on the walls, using labels, actively preserving and displaying stuff that illustrates the use of different materials and techniques for future students. Within our research, we produce and use original floor plans of the workshops that you see here. That's one that I got from the workshop specialist, and then we translated it into a workable workshop. And this is one that was really neat. I also got stuff where I really had to ask them again what it actually says on the thing that they produced. And we use these research tools or this as a research tool because it allows us to see not only how a workshop is equipped and arranged, but also which possibilities as well as restrictions these arrangements offer for movement. The resulting maps are a tool to trace the movements of the makers, materials and tools in space, and serve as a visual support during interviews with the specialists and the students about the process of making. Through the tracing of movement, we can research the impact of the arranged space on the resulting choreographies of the students and specialists who learn and teach how to make in these workshops. And now we're gonna move to the next category also. Art Academy students working in the lithography workshop move through the space according to the steps of the technique, as I already said. Starting at the back with recreating the stones, for example, and then ending by printing and doing the finishing touches on the clean table. In the plastics workshop, the arrangement of the spaces and the connection between the spaces with doors makes it possible and easy to move back and forth between the different areas of the workshop. Also not that easy because you always have to go through a door, but it's quite convenient. For example, during one participant making session, I started preparing my molds of wax, clay, and bread in the dust area of the workshop, seated on a table, and placed the molds directly onto plexiglass so I would be able to take them actually with me to the chemical laboratory where I would mix the liquid plastics and pour it into the molds. During the 15 minutes in which I was waiting for the plastic, the polyethylene, to harden, I would clean up the table, make room for the demolding, and get a coffee, you know, because that's also has to happen, leaving the workshop for a bit. And then during these participant makings, and I promised I would come back to this, in the plastic workshops, I filmed my hands, making hands with a GoPro camera attached to a chest harness. Documenting my process in this way makes it possible to, one, immerse myself in the process of making and being in the flow. I think you know that, to just be able to make. And then two, to be able to actually rewatch it and analyze it and reflect upon the choreographies of my hands. The resulting videos, in a sense, enable a researcher like me to prolong the time span in which reflection in and on action is possible. Watching the video, one can relive the process of making and see the hands think and actually notice aspects of the process that one simply did not see while being in the flow. And I have an example for that. For example, while I was pouring polyethylene in my bread mold, which I did, I baked the bread, made the mold, I was really proud. I was also in conversation with the student who was at work in the chemical laboratory too. And I was observing her process of intuitively mixing the liquid plastics with liquid colorants, and therefore only noticed a few minutes later that my mold was actually leaking. And you will see that in a second. And while I was watching the video later that day, I could discern the leaking mold immediately after pouring. I don't know if you can see it already. There it is. All the plastic pouring out, but I'm still doing my thing, talking to this other student. And you will see in a second how that actually turns out. During 2 participant observation sessions, I also traced the movements of a 4th-year product design students on the floor plans of the wood workshop and the plastic workshop both. But especially her making process in the wood workshop brought forward an important subcategory, setting up the immediate workspace or mise en place. Kneebone, that Anne-Sophie already mentioned, the great guy, medicine dude who wrote the expert book, adopted the concept of mise en place from the culinary world to emphasize the significance of the categorization of the organization of the workspace in advanced learning. So how important it is to actually arrange what is right around you. He argues that beginners easily overlook how the workspace is structured because they are focused on individual tasks, which makes sense, right? You learn and you're busy with doing something, doing what the workshop specialist tells you. More experience, on the other hand, leads, according to him, to an understanding of the importance of preparing and maintaining one's own workspace. The 4th-year product design student learned from her experience how important it is to gather all the wood clamps she needs before starting the process of gluing, because otherwise all the clamps could possibly be in use. Things happen, right? She took control over her immediate work environment by gathering the clamps, the glue, the tape, and all other stuff that she needed to make beforehand. So she was setting up her mise en place, like with cooking. The arrangement of each workshop, including immediate work environments, enabled specific movements. The square format of the plastic workshop, as well as the doors, afford another way of movement than the rectangular shape of the lithography workshop that matches the process of making a lithography print. The geographies and choreographies of educational workshops are inextricably linked. Rearrangements of the space due to, for example, new machines and tools or COVID-19 measurements, which I think you all experience, change the geographies and the possible choreographies of the workshops. The aforementioned floor plans of the workshop make it possible to trace the movements and to research the connection to the geographies and notice and reflect on the changes in the choreographies. This leads to a better understanding of the role of the workshop space and the movement within the space in the process of teaching and learning making. Specifically, the concept of mise en place draws attention to the importance of the immediate workshop, as I already said. It emphasizes the learning curve, the experience and knowledge needed to be able to take control over one's own workspace, to literally be able to arrange the affordances to oversee one's movement. The filming of the moving hands with the GoPro camera enables me to scrutinize choreographies in the workshop on a micro level. That's why we call it the micro geographies, because it's a choreography, sorry. These 2 words, I'm sorry. Filming my own hands as well as those of students allow me to study the process of making up close, relive and notice situations that one quickly overlooks while being immersed in the process of making. Like the floor plans, including mise en place, the GoPro images are a research tool that help to study the complexity of making, for example, by reflecting on participant making sessions or using it as a visual support for an interview with a student and or specialist. That is something that I do, asking them to wear this thing too, and then to talk about what we actually see afterwards. Okay, I'm now moving to the third category, the instructional stuff. In an educational workshop, makers move through the space and encounter next to materials, tools what we have termed instructional stuff. We have found instructional stuff to exist in two subcategories, permanent and ephemeral. While the former, typically charts and instruction, is permanently kept and in use in the workshops, the latter emerges most of the time spontaneously during a process of making and easily gets discarded afterwards, so gets thrown out again. Charts of material properties or illustrations of specific processes of techniques as well as works by previous students are permanently displayed by the workshop specialists to be able to illustrate the affordances of materials and techniques in question. There's examples of the lithography workshop, for example, and here are examples of students' work from the silkscreen workshop in Groningen. Also, failures are, for example, a piece of wood that broke easily because the student would not work with the wood crane, are kept for illustrative purposes in the workshops. I unfortunately don't have a photo of that. This subcategory of permanent instructional stuff is either displayed on the wall and or has a specific place in the workshop where it can be handily picked up, moved, handled, and passed around during the, for example, instructional sessions. In the letterpress and bookbinding workshop, and Harm can recognize himself now on the photo, a few examples of composed types are displayed to show the possibilities of working with letterpress printing. For example, the word composed of movable letters. These examples are not transportable and the students are not allowed to touch them because the composition is fragile and much time and effort has gone into arranging the small movable letters in this particular way. The workshop specialist also has a collection of different books and prints and papers and everything to actually show the different types of paper and binding. And that is what she is doing on the image on this side. So can't think about that right now. There, where Harm is on the photo too. Permanent instructional stuff therefore either has a fixed and static place in the workshop, for example on the wall, or in this case on the cardboard as you see here, or it has a specific place, for example in a shelf, from where it can be passed around for instructions. Or in the case of the fashion CID workshop here in Bremen, instructional stuff, in this case possible patterns for the new knitting machine that was just installed when I was here for the last time, is displayed and hanged. I don't know if it's still hanging there, but I think they made it for this purpose to actually be illustrative of what is possible with this machine. Ephemeral instructional stuff, which is often spontaneously produced by the specialists in the process of passing on knowledge, usually gets discarded at the end of the process. For example, in the plaster workshop, we observed the specialist making a quick sketch on a paper towel to support his instructions and explanations to a student who was working on a mold. Every year, when we visit the lithography workshop with the first year art history student, as I already told you, the specialist sketches directly onto the limestone to explain the properties of the stone, the ingredients of the lithographic crayon, and the basic principles of the technique, the immiscibility of water and oil. The stone is reground after the session, making it an instructional object that is recreated every year. In the academic year of 2019-20, a student who was packing up and getting ready to leave quickly made a little thank you sketch, which you might already discover, on the limestone, which the workshop specialist discovered only a few minutes later. It's a nice note to leave, right? Also, permanent instructional stuff sometimes gets discarded. The painting and drawing workshop specialist, for example, still regrets that several still life paintings made by his predecessor were thrown away when the workshop was disposed of due to cutbacks and lack of interest from the students. Every still life showed exactly the same motive, but was painted with a bit different brand of paint to illustrate the distinct qualities of the different paints. Since the workshop was reopened, the specialist made new illustrative examples for the students that are displayed on the workshop walls and also on the windows. It's actually the space that he uses because the light goes onto that really easily and to show how the paint actually changes due to light that falls onto it. So it has a purpose. Yes, and they highlight the qualities of materials, and that is ranging from canvas and paint to varnish. Varnish is something that you see there on top, and the paints that he keeps there, also pigments for workshops and instructions that he does. Instructional stuff, either permanent or ephemeral, creates awareness about the workspace, the mise en place, and the transference of knowledge. Instructional stuff makes aspects of the making process explicit, and thereby in combination with sound, and I will come to that now, including language, helps to structure the process of learning making. Especially ephemeral instructional stuff makes clear that learning making needs to take place in practice because one needs to experience it. It's quite simple. Okay, last category, sound. When thinking of sound, the first thing that comes to mind is probably music. In most workshops, music is played ranging from radio channels to the specialist's favorite playlist. I also noticed this in Bremen, for example, in the silk screen workshop. I had a whole conversation with her about her CD collection. The sound of music contributes to the experience of making. For example, while I was developing black and white photos during a participant making session in Groningen, that would have been a very different experience if there would have been no classic rock coming from the speakers. That is their preferred music there. I would have not danced around in the darkroom while moving the photo from the developer to the fixer and finally to the stoppers. I was there alone, so I could move quite freely there. That was handy for my choreography there, literally and figuratively. I would have not, that I already said. Some of the workshop specialists prefer actually the sound of making, the sound of tools and materials, as well as quiet intervals in between, because the recognition and identification of sounds also play an important role in making. For instance, the specialist of the lithography workshop enjoys listening to, in his words, the singing stones, the rhythmic sound the limestone makes when during the physical exercise of graining. I don't know if you have done that before, but the stones on stones make a really particular sound with the carbon. I don't know the word for it right now. I have it somewhere. If you want to know, I will look it up for you. In all printing workshops, recognizing sound is crucial to get an even layer of ink on the roller. The specialist of the letterpress and bookbinding workshop describes the rind sound as squishy, the sound that rollers make when the ink is distributed evenly, not too thin, not too thick. While Kneebone, and we already heard about him, argues that the engraver he interviewed judges the ink distribution by ear, not by eye. Neurologist Frank R. Wilson, the guy who wrote about hands, for example, nuances the involvement of the senses based on an interview with a jeweler. The jeweler noticed that vision plays a big part, but also emphasizes that the physical feeling, for example, sound, that occurs, and quote, when the tool you're holding is in the proper position and is making the proper contact, end of quote. That is something that he said. That's really important. It's proper, that is repeated also. The workshop specialists are, as these interviewed craftsmen, experts in recognizing and identifying sounds. For example, the specialist of the metal workshop, and you saw him already all the way in the beginning, he knows only by listening to the sounds of the welding machine whether or not the student is using the machine correctly. He could, for example, just stay in his office and just scream, like, you have to do this and this, give adjusting instructions. He doesn't do that, but he could just turn his back around and do that. Instructions, or broadly speaking, communication, can also be sound which are produced in the workshop, something we might not directly consider when we think about sounds in workshops. Using a word like squishy to indicate a multisensory awareness of the distribution of ink on the rollers exposes the importance of language in the process of making. We will test it if it works. Then you can still
At some point you want to change your leg, you're going to get one muscled leg and one limpy leg.
to hear it, but it is also the machine makes
The rollers also, they get it.
There's this, she also makes this all the time, the sound. I should record her doing this so I can use it the next time. The body of the maker, including sensory perception, emotions, and feelings, is, as argued before, embedded in all four categories: the geographies, the choreographies, the instructional stuff, and sound. The body and the senses should be seen as overarching, connecting all the elements involved in making. But why then highlight sound and thereby the senses of hearing, or the sense of hearing, as a distinct category? Hearing, as we have noticed, is an acute indicator sense in the process of making. This might also be true for other senses, but we want to highlight with this category that sound is not intuitive or vague, but deeply perceptive and structured. By choosing sound as a distinct category, we draw attention to the fact that there is a less clear distinction between language as a structured form of communication and sound as a more intuitive form of communication. We therefore take sound to include communication, language, and terminology because we have observed how instructional language is led by sounds of tools, machines, and materials, the squishy ink rolls being a perfect example of that. In each workshop, specific terminology connected to materials and techniques in questions is used. Makes sense, right? Furthermore, each workshop specialist uses creative, poetic language to describe a multisensory awareness, such as the singing stones, which we just talked about. All workshop specialists make use of metaphors, and they are mostly connected to daily life. One specific reference point is food. I don't know if you know that, but that is one. The specialist in the plaster workshop, for example, refers to yogurt to clarify which consistency the resulting plaster water mixture ideally needs to have. And I'm sure there are much more examples of food. Some metaphors are apparently universal in such a way that they occur in several workshops, at least in Groningen. I heard the Lego metaphor a lot of times. They use Lego to explain things. It makes it really clear to people because everybody knows. It's really prominent. But in the international educational context of art academies, different languages are used. Both in Groningen and in Bremen, the workshop specialists give instructions in their mother tongue as well as in English. And workshop specialists need to look up, memorize, and memorize actually specific terminology in English. The specialist of the silkscreen workshop here in Bremen, for example, she told me, uses a book about bookbinding techniques, which contains German descriptions as well as English translations, so she can use that while teaching. She literally said, and it is not that exhausting also for her, which makes, I think, also sense. I heard that in Groningen also several of times. She also started and maintains a collection of a step-by-step list of the process of preparing the silkscreen in different languages. I don't know if you look at this and if you're often in the silkscreen workshop, but then you probably used it. These lists are framed and displayed on the walls in the part of the workshop where the silk screens are prepared. In this way, they also function as instructional stuff that I already described as a category. Okay, I'm now coming to my conclusion of this. In this lecture, we presented research methods for studying making. I have defined making and illustrated 4 categories which we have found in our research to be informative to workshop epistemologies, geographies, choreographies, instructional stuff, and sound. In a way, the matrix presented here is related to making itself, because it needs close focus on the things at hand, experiencing making, being in the workshop, moving in the space, using instructional stuff and communication, and then stepping back and looking at and embed and connect these findings to apparently larger issues such as the cultural, the economic, the political, the environmental, the historical, the ethical, the social circumstances of making that are in the circle, in the outer circle of this matrix that we present. Question that these categories that are in the outer circle raise or that come to mind are which spaces are made available for workshops at art academies? What kind of budget is provided by the Art Academy financial department for the workshops? How are the workshops embedded in the curriculums? Which aesthetical considerations play a role in teaching and learning making? Which environmental considerations are made in the workshops? How inclusive is the process of teaching and learning making? These are all questions based on these categories that you see here. And I'm right now searching for answers to these questions. That is the point where I actually have arrived right now in my PhD research, which asks me actually to move back and forth in between the rings of the circle of the matrix that we propose here. So to be continued. Thank you.